we want to design beautiful buildings, beautiful spaces that are naturally daylit, that remind us of our connection to nature, right? As soon as we live in a bunker with no windows, it's very easy to forget that there is a world outside. It's very depressing as well, but it's also very easy to forget that we are part of nature and that we are connected to the world. And that engagement between the interior and exterior environment is so critical, I think. We see it in all of the research that shows, hospital patients get out of their beds faster and have shorter stays when they have more windows and more natural light. Employees are more productive. Students get better test scores. We are just better for having more beautiful buildings with higher to window to wall ratios. But those higher to window to wall ratios are in tension with a lot of sustainability objectives. We are able to give architects the toolkit to achieve their aesthetic vision and to make the best building possible for their clients while also achieving their environmental objectives.
Well, welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. And this week, I am very pleased to be joined by Peter Dushenski, who is Managing Director of GlasCurtain in Canada. But perhaps more importantly, he's also a speaker at our upcoming Decarb Connect Canada event, which takes place in early November. Peter, welcome. Very pleased to have you on. And as I was saying before we came on air, thank you for agreeing at such short notice.
Well, thank you for having me, Alex. As I was saying, it's a pleasure to be on this side of the microphone for a change, and looking forward to our conversation today.
Great. Well, I've already briefed you. Many of our listeners know this. I have a kind of classic question that I like to start with, which is to ask you to really kind of give us a bit of a feel for how you've arrived at this point in time. And just to add a little bit more context to the audience, we're going to be talking about the importance of startup companies in catalyzing both social and, in this, in our world, industrial change, our world being the area that we are both so deeply involved in. So how did Peter Dushenski end up working in this particular space and kind of touching on these issues of climate and sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, like so many things, the paths are at once non-linear and a bit, they run in the family at the same time as well. So as far back as I can tell, I'm in the fourth generation of being in the building manufacturing sort of space, starting back with my great-grandfather, maternal great-grandfather in Romania, actually, where they were manufacturers of composite building materials. As it happens, ceramic tile specifically. And that was going back into the 1930s, before those lovely communist folks came along and decided that they didn't need to have their own business anymore, and that the people should have that business. Suffice to say, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, then eventually immigrated to Canada with my mother and uncle and his wife, grandmother, in the 1960s to Montreal, where he worked as a curtain wall engineer for one of the largest curtain wall companies in North America, actually. And they did actually all the curtain wall at Canary Wharf in London at the time. So I have a connection to London as well. But he was in the curtain wall and in the manufacturing space. They had all their own dyes, all their own designs. They did doors and windows and curtain walls and all these things. And then my mother was actually an architect, or is an architect. And then this business was founded as was co-founded as a sort of semi-family enterprise, and then the product was essentially developed, which is the product that I suppose on the audio podcast you can't see, but is the frame which is sitting behind me here on the wall on the shelf, and is a fiberglass framed curtain wall system, as a product that was developed over the course of about 5 years, and basically took the sort of knowledge of the residential fiberglass window space, which has been well developed, has been around for 40 some years at this point, and then knowledge of the curtain wall industry, which is mostly aluminum frame systems, and then brought those sort of knowledge bases together to bring the glass curtain system into reality. And then this product had no market, no distribution, no clients effectively, and so they kind of tapped me on the shoulder, and I had actually was just on a sabbatical. I had studied immunology and infection at the University of Alberta, thinking I was going to be in med school someday. Ended up actually going into environmental public health, where I studied at Concordia University in Edmonton, and then worked for the provincial government as a health inspector of all things for a few years before going on sabbatical, and then was tapped to run GlasCurtain effectively, starting in marketing and ultimately into management. And a dozen years later, give or take, here we are, growing and expanding, and seizing new opportunities. We're now international. We have our first project under construction in the United States as well, in Boston at the Boston Medical Center, which we're very proud of. But yeah, we're a Canadian startup company in the building manufacturing space, and doing fun things in terms of decarbonization, in terms of reducing embodied carbon and operational carbon. And we're excited to hear more of these conversations sort of come to the fore.
Okay, that's a great, really good intro. It kind of helps us understand a little bit about the dynamic of the business, but also, as you touched on there, leads in really to why you're on our podcast versus others, which is this link to embodied carbon in your sector, this link to CO2 footprint of the kind of broader sector that you're in. So can you give us just the one or two lines on what it is that you're doing now? And we will come back to this later in the conversation, but what's the kind of the decarbonisation thread in particular that GlasCurtain is bringing to market?
Absolutely. And the big one is, it starts with operational carbon, and which is a function of thermal performance, right? Especially in cold climate architecture, which is a niche, right? I mean, this is not Florida architecture. This is not California architecture. It's not Arizona architecture. It's not, Mediterranean architecture. This is Canadian semi-Arctic, architecture. And, we're dealing with -40 in the winter as a pretty standard temperature that we deal with in most of our projects. Many of the projects we do up in the Canadian territories, in places like Whitehorse, places like Iqaluit, we're dealing with -50 and -60 in the winter. And so thermal performance is a huge driver when it comes to reducing energy demands, reducing heating and ventilation requirements. And then, of course, the net result of all of these sort of very tangible benefits are the somewhat more intangible benefits of reducing operational carbon impact as well. It also just so happens that fiberglass is also a low embodied carbon product as well. So not only does it benefit the operational side dramatically by having about twice the thermal performance of aluminum frame system, it also has, half of the embodied carbon, or less than half of the embodied carbon of aluminum frame systems as well. So it's a whole package, and that's kind of what we bring to market.
Okay, useful. Thank you. And again, we'll come back to that a little bit later as well. But let's come back to this topic. And actually, people who listen may not know that the topic and the themes that our guests come to the recording with are very much chosen by them. They're normally a theme that they feel quite passionate about. So just as a kind of a starting point, I'm curious about you framed this discussion very much as this idea of how startups, smaller businesses can catalyze social and industrial change. Just as a starting point, what is it about that? Like why that? Why was that what came to mind as the yes, this is what we should talk about? What is it about that intrigues you?
Well, I think it's about life cycles, and it's not about necessarily product life cycles, but about company life cycle, right? Every company starts from zero, right? Every company starts from somewhere, and it grows. It is sort of like, I'm sure many of our listeners have children, right? You notice that they start very small, and then, by the time they're 18 or so, they kind of stop growing, at least vertically. And then they sort of plateau until they're sort of in their 50s, and then they start to shrink a little bit, right? This is, I think, a fractal of the way all organizations and all systems work. Whether it's a country, whether it's a business, whether it's an individual, I think we all sort of see these, very rapid, almost nonlinear growth curves, in the early phase of development where everything is possible. Then you see a sort of relative plateau, and then ultimately you eventually see stagnation and decline. And that's inevitable in basically every business. There's never been an eternal business. There's never been an eternal country. There's never been an eternal organization of any human description. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to seed new life, right? to bring that new vitality, that new energy. I mean, any of us who have children, and I have two wonderful young boys, or you have grandchildren. For those of you listening on the podcast, seeing that new life is one of the most energizing and powerful things in the world. And that's exactly true in business as well. In business, having new life, new ideas, new generations. I mean, we wouldn't have, you know, an electric car industry in North America were it not for one, very bold South African and his business ventures, right? With the support of the government, of course. The government was, the Obama administration was essential to making sure that that was a reality. But we wouldn't have that without, fresh life. The Fords and the GMs of the world were not going to do that on their own, right? Those are famous, well-known stories of, who killed the electric car, right? And that's true in all businesses and all industries. That, things that have been around for a long time, it's very hard for them to stay current. They get very large, they get very bureaucratic, and it's only from these new sprouts in the ground that we see renewal, and that's what a startup is.
So, I mean, I love this kind of the visual of these smaller, nimble, high growth companies, and that idea that they launch into a market and disrupt is, yeah, we see that all the time. We definitely see that, particularly in this industrial decarbonization space, where, as you say, the kind of incumbent businesses, many of which are decades, if not hundreds of years old, have a method that works. It has a market that works and responds to disruption. That's where we're seeing this response to decarbonization come from in part. What is it? And when we were prepping this, you talked about the link between a smaller, more nimble company being able to almost provide larger companies with social license for change. What do you mean by, like, when you presented that thought to me, it really stuck with me as a sort of interesting thing, because a lot of the larger companies tend to talk about disruptors as a competitor threat or as a sort of a driving, a driving force, versus perhaps talking about it in that kind of language. So what do you mean by that? What do you see happening?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I use the term social license to, you know, it is a function of competition for sure. And when, it can sort of drive these when a larger company sees that there's a smaller, nimbler company with a disruptive, innovative, next generation idea, they, to the extent that they feel threatened is the extent to which they will respond, right? And so to the extent that they see this new idea as competition is the extent to which they will be motivated, right? Without that, poking, without that prodding, they will just coast forever, right? They will just keep, being large and monopolistic and, large and relatively stagnant, right? Until they see that until they sort of sense the winds of change. And that winds of change, again, has to come from, the ground up, from the grassroots, from the startup sort of space, from the innovative world. And I think that, once those sort of smaller companies start to snowball a little bit and gain a little bit more traction, it's harder and harder to ignore. And, there are elements within these large organizations that will eventually start to respond. And they will see that, this isn't just something that's, possible in the abstract, possible in the theoretical space, that this can be done in the practical, real world of business, of technology, of innovation, of manufacturing, of industry. And so I think that's the opportunity, really even the responsibility for startup companies to show larger companies what's possible. Because once you're in one of these large companies, you have very little degrees of freedom, right? If you just live in your own bubble. And so once you sort of see what's possible out there in the world, I think it does provide social license and sort of shows what is possible, for other participants.
For other entities, yeah. Okay, well, so that's our kind of starting point then, isn't it? Which is these kind of earlier stage disruptive businesses are needed. They bring innovation to market, products we all want and need, but they also act as a change initiator, a driver for bigger companies to sort of start progress in a direction of travel like decarbonisation and climate. The challenge, though, as we have talked about on this podcast before, is a lot of great companies, a lot of companies with a fantastic product or a strong business model don't get through those early stages and therefore aren't able to sustain themselves and have that impact which they, were aiming for from the beginning. So how do we help more entrepreneurs survive that early stage? How do we set people up for success, do you think?
That is such a great question. And I think if we all had an answer to that, I think we could. I think the world would be, a more prosperous and wonderful place. Um, I think like so many so many attempts to build institutions, it does start with education. I think that anyone who spends enough time in the world of policy, in the world of change, of innovation, of politics, of what have you, of the competitive business sphere or political sphere or what have you, um, comes back to the importance of education. And and I think that North America is, the United States in particular probably does a better job than almost anywhere else in the world in, again, providing that social license to children to say, you can build a great company. You can go, create something new, and there's space for you to do that here. I know that's much harder in Europe, for example. I know that there are other parts of the world that the avenues are, more constrained when it comes to the sort of the status of entrepreneurs, right, socially. Everyone's in many ways competing for social validation for their efforts. And if it's just easier to be a doctor or a lawyer than it is to be an entrepreneur, and an entrepreneur is like next to the street sweeper or something like this, then no one's going to want to be an entrepreneur. But if an entrepreneur is like being a doctor or a lawyer, well, then you'll have more entrepreneurs. um, I don't know that I have a solution per se for parts of the world that are less inclined to see the sort of higher potential, the higher sort of status and importance of innovation in from entrepreneurship. But I think that the United States is kind of world leading in that in many regards. I think China seems to do that relatively well to some degrees. I mean, certainly it's had a strong last 40 years, especially in manufacturing. But I think that the whole world, I think India will do well in the next 40 years as well. I think there are many parts of the world that show a lot of promise, and in terms of entrepreneurship. But I do think it starts with seeing it as a possibility in grade school, and having those conversations with those fertile minds that are always looking for paths in the world.
You think, I mean, when obviously you're rooted in Canada, but selling internationally, uh, are you seeing, if we think about the Canadian landscape, right, for this question, do you see things in other regions that help either a climate-based startup or a smaller family business, like yours, which is going international? Are there things you see in other regions that could help more of these uh, technologies, these services companies succeed and thrive? What are you seeing elsewhere?
Yeah, I think what we see in Canada at least is, and you see this in many regions in the world, is critical mass is so important, right? And so that's why the sort of the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, is so vibrant and so successful when it comes to innovation, when it comes to manufacturing, even when it comes to building. There's a critical mass of people, and there is, and that's a challenge for us where we are on the prairies, right? The Canadian prairies. I mean, we're 1,000 kilometers from Vancouver and 3,000 kilometers from Montreal, right? And we're 800 kilometers from the U.S. border. So we're kind of you know, we're we're a little bit isolated in many respects, and it's hard to have a critical mass. And this is why having a high-speed train between Edmonton and Calgary is such a dream for us one day, that we could connect these two 1.5 million person cities into a 3 million person city, and that would be effectively an effective region, right? But critical mass is so important, and infrastructure, to allow those people to, the public infrastructure, whether it's trains, whether it's, lime scooters, whether it's bicycle lanes, whatever it is that can allow a critical mass of people to share ideas, to collaborate, to mix, I think is so critical. And, like you see in the Shenzhen area in China, right? Like, 50 years ago, there was like 100,000 people there, and today there's 100 million people there. That's a critical mass of manufacturing, right? So you can have your 3 nanometer, iPhone chips made there and kind of nowhere else in the world because there's a critical mass of manufacturing and expertise. And it takes probably, 5 or 10 million people to kind of have that critical mass. And the only place in Canada that has that critical mass, Montreal's close, but it's really the greater Toronto area. So, those little hubs, I think, are important in every country to have, every place in the world to have those sort of areas of expertise and those, again, critical masses of people and ideas and competition and sparks, right, to create new ideas.
Okay, well, slightly different question for you then. One of the things we hear quite a lot from the various types of industrials we work with, from companies just like yours that are creating these lower carbon or carbon neutral materials being sold down value chains, is that it's sometimes hard to get that acceleration of buyers that you need for a real market to emerge. I'm curious about what you're seeing around that. Obviously, you think you sell more than one type of product, but what are you seeing in that space, and what do you think it would take to get more rapid adoption of some of these greener, lower CO2 materials in construction, specifically?
That's a great question. And I think that, lower carbon impact has to be part of a larger story, right? If it's just a focus on, a metric that people can't touch and feel, it's almost like, how many milligrams of sodium are in your food? It's, plus or minus 10%, plus or minus 50%. It's very intangible, for most people. You look at the label on the soda or, the snack bar, it doesn't mean a whole lot. And I think that, unfortunately, the challenge of the sort of the carbon communication space is that it's very intangible, right? It's not something, there's not even a clear metric of what is an acceptable amount, right? What is the correct amount? It's very loosely defined. And I think that this is, successes can be whatever we want it to be, I guess, but we still have to convey what does success ultimately look like. And so, I think the sort of the low hanging fruit is, do better, right? The low hanging fruit is let's do better than we were yesterday, right? But I think that even that has to be contextual and to say that, we need to also consider, where are products being made? If we have a lower carbon, building product, for example, that's made in Asia and it's, at the expense of, local manufacturing and local and domestic experience, that building material isn't going to, it may be a little bit cheaper, it may be a little bit lower carbon, but it's not going to have the same impact on the community. And chances are it's not going to last as long. People will probably, without having a connection to the building products, to our environment, right? Because my cousin was the carpenter and my other, and my uncle was the plumber and my other, my son-in-law was the manufacturer of the building material. When you have a community that's building buildings, there's a much deeper connection to those and they're more durable as a result. They're better looked after as a result. And I think that's also what defines a community, right? Is having a local vernacular, having local connection. And I think that, we need the carbon part of the conversation to be part of that sort of local connection and conversations about durability and long-term impact as well. And so I think that that's the real opportunity for this space is to have carbon be part of a broader conversation. If you just focus on carbon, it's just too abstract at every part of the value chain, and it's too easy to optimize for and make other mistakes. You can pollute the world in 1,000 other ways. Honestly, you can pollute the environment in 1,001 other ways. And you've just optimized for carbon, what have we really done? Right? We can have 1/100th of the carbon, reduce our carbon by 99%. But if we polluted the rest of the world 100 times more in sulfur dioxide, in nitrous oxides, in smog, and reduced air quality, water quality, what have you, I don't know that we're doing ourselves or the world a very great service. And so I think it needs to be part of a much broader conversation about community, about the environment more broadly. And I think that's the opportunity for carbon to zoom out a little bit and not sort of lose the forest for the trees.
When you think about clients that you approach who are, open to and kind of buying into the story of lower CO2, and that concept of communication and how to sell the story, what is it that they are buying from you, do you think? If it's not, and I'm kind of really interested in that idea that it's not just about where it's not just about the CO2. So what are they buying from you? What's the bigger story or that they see in that?
Yeah, I think the carbon piece is honestly a big reason why we are successful on many projects. So I certainly don't want to diminish its importance, and it's having a moment, as it were, right? In a way, it wasn't 10 years ago, right? When we were just getting started, we had done our life cycle assessments. We knew how far ahead we were when it came to embodied carbon. And the operational carbon is just a function of thermal performance in our climate. And that we knew we were way ahead of the game of the curve there as well. So I think that when it comes to, a lot of architects that we're dealing with are extremely interested in reducing and improving their carbon impacts of their buildings. And I think that they're doing a great job. And I think that that's one of the key things one of the key stories that we can tell is a reduction in embodied carbon and operational carbon. And I think it's also you know, part of the conversation of, having a higher window to wall ratio, right? Of having a more beautiful building that still meets energy code requirements, that still meets the voluntary standards of Passive House, of LEED, of net zero, zero carbon standards, or what have you, but is, again, part of a broader conversation of, yes, we need to be responsible stewards of our planet. And if we all live in ugly, horrible, miserable buildings, is that a good trade-off? Probably not, right? So we want to design beautiful buildings, beautiful spaces that are naturally daylit, that remind us of our connection to nature, right? As soon as we live in a bunker with no windows, it's very easy to forget that there is a world outside. It's very depressing as well, but it's also very easy to forget that we are part of nature and that we are connected to the world. And that engagement between the interior and exterior environment is so critical, I think, to, and we see it in all of the research that shows, oh, hospital patients get out of, their beds faster and have shorter stays when they have more windows and more natural light. Isn't that remarkable? Right? People are, employees are more productive when they have access to views and natural light. Students get better test scores when they have access to views and natural light. We are just better for having more beautiful buildings with higher to window to wall ratios. But those higher to window to wall ratios are in tension with a lot of sustainability objectives, right? And so we are able to give architects, not only the social license, but really the toolkit to achieve their aesthetic vision and, to make the best building possible for their clients while also achieving their environmental objectives. And that is, in the best sense, having our cake and eating it too. And that's kind of, that's the conversation that we're able to have. And a big part of that is reducing our carbon impact while still having a beautiful building, right? Like these things don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? A low carbon building doesn't have to, look like a Soviet bunker or something, right? It can be daylit and architectural, right? It doesn't have to be, drab and dreary. That, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have a better world, a more beautiful world that is also more sustainable.
I'm interested in that because as you're talking, I'm thinking of two things that I'm going to attempt to link to them because this idea that how we sell the value of a lower carbon product, how we describe it, how we sell the story around it, that link in your case between performance and the CO2 footprint is, and the relative beauty and, the visual aesthetic that's capable of. The story of how do we create more drive to buy these lower CO2 products, I think is something that comes up a lot in our world. And I'm thinking there's two particular angles to it. One is, on the one hand, industrials and different types of companies saying, yes, 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 we can do all this work, but will clients pay for it? And when they say that, what they mean is CO2 reduction. So let's just put that on one side for a moment. Then on the other side, they're talking about, we like to work with new innovative companies with new technologies for reducing carbon or whatever else. But what's the business model? But your point is those two things are all part of the same story. What you're selling to a client is not just reduction in CO2. It's a package. It's the story around that package and what else it brings. And that is, again, coming back to the business model point, it's also you're bringing the business model for your client to then use with their client. They're then able to say, this is the full story and this is the business model for why we're using this material. I'm not sure if hopefully I'm making sense to those listening, but I've been very struck by those two arguments recently, the kind of, is there a business model, and but will people pay for it? And the answer is yes, but it needs to be sold as a package. And to your point, whether it's performance as context, whether it's aesthetic as context in construction in particular, I think that's really interesting. I just want to take this opportunity to thank our production partner and sponsor, Jano Media, for their support in delivering the Decarb Connect podcast. Over the last few years, they've helped us to facilitate great conversations that connect us with our audience, and their skills and expertise mean that we get to concentrate exclusively on generating the content, the conversations that engage, inform, and inspire. One of the other things that we hear about is sometimes the challenge that materials producers have in that green market, which seems to it's less about what an end client will often buy or pay for, and it's more about what the value chain in the middle will promote, or what the value chain in the middle understands, or how it affects their kind of sales channels and distribution. Is that, I don't, I don't obviously know much about how GlasCurtain distributes, but do you see that, or are you often quite directly in touch with clients? And yeah, what do you make of that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And the value chain of building materials is just way bigger than most people have any idea of. It's so complicated. And there's so many players that we've never heard of and that no one's ever heard of. I mean, I was actually at a composite materials conference in Paris 6 months ago, and it was the largest trade show I'd ever been to by far. Did not expect that. And it's like, oh, well, here's this company, making some resins or some other subcomponents of composite materials. And, come learn about us. We're operating in 40 countries. We have 30,000 employees. We're doing 7 billion euro a year in revenue. And no one's ever heard of them. And they're enormous, right? And so, but they're engaged, and they want to, they want to do better. And I think that, I'm not sure if that directly answers the question, but suffice to say that the opportunity, I still think, comes, or I think the drive still comes from the entrepreneurs ultimately, and that the rest of the value chain will follow the opportunities if the demand is created effectively, right? And so I'm not sure that, again, because carbon is such an abstraction, I think it's very hard for those middle chain players to necessarily, see the value from where they're standing, because they're very much in the tangible world. They're very much working with their hands. They're building things, and it's almost like trying to convince them that there's like a new tooth fairy in town, and it's one of my boys just lost one of his front teeth, this week. He's 6 years old. He's supposed to lose his front teeth, right? And the tooth fairy comes, and he's so excited. He's like, "Oh, Daddy, the tooth fairy came, gave me, a couple dollars." But trying to convince a 40-year-old or 50-year-old that there's this new abstraction in town that you should deeply care about when they've kind of, 10 years ago, again, 10 years ago, this was not a conversation, right? When they were coming up through school, when they were coming up through the system, when they were, cutting their teeth and learning the ropes, this was not part of the conversation. So it's suddenly kind of being thrust upon them. And I'm not sure they're the right audience for it. And I don't think they need to be. I think that the pull and demand and the drive for efficiency, for carbon reduction, can come from the sort of the end users of whatever it is that they're doing. And I mean, we're not even in conversation really with the clients so much. We're mostly in conversation with the architects. And, our subcomponent supplier isn't in touch with us either, right? We're getting our pultrusions for our fiberglass from, our pultrusion partner, but they have dozens and dozens of suppliers, each of whom have dozens and dozens of suppliers, right? And so our opportunity is to take what they're doing and bring it to market effectively. And we can pick and choose. And I think that's the opportunity, is almost to allow that sort of competition of subcomponent suppliers, of the ones who are making the right kinds of products, to happen, where the end users are pulling out from the network of all of these other different subcomponent manufacturers, creating something wonderful, and then, bringing that to market. And so I think that, it's almost like curation, right? Of art, right? You're in an art gallery. There's a billion paintings in the world. Why did you pick these 100? Because someone went through and picked the best, right? And that's kind of what a manufacturer is actually doing. An end manufacturer, whether you are Apple or you are Ford or, what have you, you're not making the subcomponent of the subcomponent of the subcomponent of the subcomponent. There's enormous, invisible to you value chains that you will never see and never interact with doing that. But you still have the opportunity to tell a story and to find the best of what's available. And if you can't find it, create it yourself, add it to your vertical, right? Bring it in house. And so I think that the opportunity is, I'm not sure it's necessarily, I think it will be some time, if ever, that the subcomponent supplier, all those sort of middle value chain players, quote unquote, get on board. I'm not sure it's their responsibility, because, those of us who are even on board are even such only a certain part of the market too. And they're trying to actually satisfy and cater a much broader market than what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to lead the market, and the market will follow. And so to the extent that we can lead the market, I think, people will come in line after us. But, for maybe different incentives. And I think that, I think we lead first and sort of ask questions later a little bit.
I'm curious about so your kind of conversations then about the materials that you produce are directly with the architects all the time, or are they through other people ever?
90% is just directly through the architect. Maybe the other 10% will be through, sometimes a general contractor, but more like a building envelope, consultant, like an RDH, an RJC, a Morrison Hershfield kind of thing. But 90% is architects. Yeah.
And so in your case, if I think I'm kind of extrapolating a little bit, but for some of our members who say cement manufacturers, and then they have all these different layers before someone actually buys the concrete at the end to pour on whatever site. In your case, it's a relatively short kind of set of, you need to influence the envelope consultant, you need to influence one or two other parties perhaps, but you can also have direct access to the architect or architects as a group. And so does that make the conversation easier, do you think, about the kind of the value of the kind of CO2 benefit tied to performance and so forth?
Absolutely. I mean, architects are, highly educated, highly curious. They tend to be oriented towards, the greater good, right? I mean, architects are, for how much they work, not very well remunerated, right? So they tend to be, but they tend to be, very, and yet they still draw, there's still huge numbers of people who want to be architects, because architects have such transformational and transformative potential on our societies, the way we engage with the world. was all built and much of it designed by architects, and whether that's the civil infrastructure or our, private residences or offices or, theaters or, rec centers, whatever it is. Um, Architects are so important to the world. And so their change is, non-pecuniary more often than not. So they tend to be, but they tend to sort of see themselves as stewards of the future, right? And they are literally creating the future. And so they understand the conversations about carbon in a way that someone who's, looking at just physical building products all the time and looking at how can I, miter this joint or miter that joint or add this solution or that solution at this sort of very, sort of chemical structural level. Architects are looking at a much higher plane, they're looking at the world from 30,000 feet, much more so. And that's, I think, where, the carbon conversation is much easier, much more intuitive. And I think all the kinds of, sustainability, the performance questions, right? I mean, we are, as a high performance manufacturer, at the premium end of the market, right? We're one of the higher end curtain walls on the market, full stop. And our performance justifies that. But if you're just asking, the installers, they'll say, well, it's, or general contractor, they'll say, well, it's almost, aluminum is almost as good. It's close enough. And an architect will say, actually, it's really not. If we look at this on the whole term, the whole term life cycle of the building, it's not close enough to use aluminum for the high performance buildings that we're building. And so the architects really do see the forest for the trees. And to your earlier point, it is very much incumbent upon us to give them a whole picture story, because they're then conveying that to their clients. I mean, the architects are in effect our salespeople as well. We are, selling our product to a degree, but ultimately we're providing information and a sort of, a foundation for the architects to ultimately discuss this with their clients, because they're the ones who need to sell a beautiful building, the best building possible that the client can imagine, right? And clients unfortunately aren't always as imaginative as they could be. And it's the architect's job, in a way, to sort of open up those doors of possibility and creative imagination to the client, to show them what's possible. That's why people hire architects, right? To show the world what's possible. Or else we would all just design our, off whatever we saw on Instagram last week, right? But architects see beyond that, and they can have these broader and deeper conversations. And that's why we love working with architects. It's one of the great joys of our work.
More broadly in decarbonisation, I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on how do we keep getting enough wins to keep that momentum building? Because it strikes me that, whether it's because of political cycles in countries all around the world, or investment cycles, or sentiment cycles, it feels like we go through these peaks and lulls in how people can kind of take on board and really move forward with conversations about CO2 and decarbonisation. So how do we keep that progress moving? How do we get some signs of more progress so that we don't lose the energy, frankly, of those already engaged? And by all means, you can either talk about that broadly, or you could focus in on construction and, the world in which. But what do you make of that? What do you
Well,
think
I
about
think
that?
that, it's been very exciting to see carbon come to the fore of the conversation in the last decade in a way it certainly wasn't when we were getting started in the early 2010s. And I think at the same time, I think that it's still part of this, again, this broader conversation about what is possible with our environmental stewardship, with our community building, with our, domestic manufacturing. I think that, I'm okay, I guess, with the waxing and waning of this specific part of the conversation, as long as we can make sure that we're still telling a comprehensive story about environmental stewardship and about, doing better for the future. I think as long as we can have a clear and positive vision for the future, carbon decarbonization is part of that conversation. And I don't think it's the beginning and end of that conversation, because otherwise we wouldn't have been doing anything 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago when this wasn't as much, de rigueur. And so I think that we need to sort of also anticipate what other aspects of environmental stewardship and leadership and sort of a brighter future can we imagine, right? And I think that decarbonization is part of it, and it will continue to be part of it, probably for some time to come. But I think that, again, it has to be part of this broader conversation. And I guess I don't have any particular concerns that we won't want to live in a better world in the future, right? It's like kind of, hard to imagine that people wouldn't want a better future for themselves, their communities, their families, their children. And I think decarbonization is part of that today, and it will be part of that in the future. And I think there will be other aspects of it that we continue to pull on as we look to sort of grab the popular imagination to build a better tomorrow.
Yeah, I think the kind of paraphrased sentence of yours that I'm still thinking about in my mind is it's this whole concept of how do we communicate it, how do we link it to other parts of the picture, whether it's performance or whatever else. I think that's going to sit with me as a really kind of useful concept to think about. Let me ask you a slightly self-serving question, which is obviously you are a speaker at Decarb Connect Canada coming up in a couple of month or so's time. What are you hoping to get out of that? As you know, the focus of that event is on all kinds of industries. What would you hope to walk away from that with, and what do you want to be talking about there?
Yeah, I hope that the event will, again, bring together different parts of the industry that don't necessarily run into each other so much, right? I mean, I'm going to be sharing the stage with, I believe, a gentleman from ArcelorMittal, which is one of the largest steel companies in the world, if not the largest steel company in the world. And, we are probably one of the smaller curtain wall companies in the world, if not, I don't want to say they're the smallest curtain wall, but you know, we're in different industries, but we're also on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of our size and scale. And I just think that's just a brilliant opportunity that doesn't happen every day to learn from each other and to see, okay, where could GlasCurtain be in 100 years or 80 years? That kind of size of international sort of import and capacity versus my sort of you know uh, sort of panel mate, I suppose, will be able to see all of the opportunity that a small company, the nimbleness that a small company is able to achieve that a large company simply can't. So I think what I'm looking forward to as much as anything, to also see some folks from the policy side, some different client groups as well. A lot of the conferences that we do are mostly architects, and so to sort of see be part of a broader conversation, and to sort of have that the multi-scale conversation as well, I think is a very exciting opportunity that we're very much looking forward to.
Well, I definitely think they will benefit from a lot of things that you're bringing to the table, but that conversation about what is the right way to communicate a CO2 benefit so that it is
And
a
yeah,
bankable, viable, believable product. I think there's something in
Yeah.
that no matter what the size or scale of business you are, I think a lot of people will find that interesting and grab hold of that. So I look forward to meeting you in person, not just over a screen there. And thank you, Peter, for talking to us about both the background of the business, this and very much this idea of what those smaller, more nimble companies can achieve. It's been really interesting to talk with you.
An absolute pleasure, Alex.
At Jano Media, we recognise that great content has the power to create impactful and positive change for lives and society. Whether that's video, live streams, photography or podcasts, partnering with us will enable you to harness the power of content to engage, inform and inspire. Reach out to us today.